I'm Catherine Ryman, and along with Bruce Peterson, I helm the Authors and Artists series, and I'm delighted to moderate and be able to bring to you today, today's program, Visions and Revisions, Two Princeton Poets at Home and Abroad. And at least on my screen, bookending me are our two Princeton poets and classmates, David Groff and Stelios Steve Mormoris. Both of them have recently published new books. David's Live in Suspense is the third book for this award-winning poet. He is a winner of the Louise Bogan Award, and as also a winner of a Lambda Literary Award for his prior work. And after getting his AB in English from Princeton, he got an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop and an MA in nonfiction from the University of Iowa. And in addition to being an independent book editor, he teaches creative writing. And Steve has got a really interesting background. He's published in a long list of publications, too long to mention, but has his first book, The Oculus, out to much acclaim, and has a second one coming. And I think both David and Steve have had such interesting journeys since Princeton, which are only first converging here with this, which is really kind of cool for all of us. So I'm going to turn it to them and ask them to tell you a little bit about, how you got into poetry, where it all began, and where we are now. David, why don't we start with you?
Okay. Well, I went to Princeton with knowing that I really loved to write. I'd had good experiences in high school and loved my English classes and loved them at Princeton, but I went to Princeton with the idea that I really wanted to be president of the United States. Someone had to do it, and I thought, well, me. So I took a lot of politics classes, even as I was inching my way over to 185 Nassau. But the politics courses, maybe it was the ones I chose, but there were, they just didn't quite galvanize me the way some of the English things did. I mean, I loved the game of it all, the learning the history and the context. Didn't always like the readings. And I was doing more at 185 Nassau with some great teachers. And then I had kind of a semi-pivotal moment in Fred Greenstein's American presidency class in the politics department, where Donald Rumsfeld came to visit our class. He had just been defense secretary, and this was 1977. And I think he was on some kind of study thing at the Woodrow Wilson School. And he came into our class, and I asked him a question about history and politics and how that affected decisions, and he reamed me out. He could not have been more contemptuous. And I actually have written a piece about this that you can find in HuffPost Personals on the occasion of his death. So that was the final kind of tipping point, my encounter with Donald Rumsfeld, class of '54, that led me into 185 Nassau Street, where I had some great teachers. Stanley Plumley, this big, wonderful bear of a man. I ultimately worked with Maxine Kuhlman, whom some of you know, and somehow that became the thing to do, along with the English department. English department didn't teach much contemporary lit. So by the real place I got it was in that converted elementary school. And once I was kind of there and falling in love with poetry and reading poetry by people who were alive, a whole new concept. And when I was immersed in Keats and Yeats over in Makash, it really became alive for me. And I knew my path right to do a creative thesis with Stephen Berg of American Poetry Review and Maxine Kuhlman as my second reader. So I didn't look, after Donald Rumsfeld in the basement of the Woodrow Wilson School, I kind of didn't look back, and then powered right through on that track at Princeton.
Okay, Steve, over to you.
So very nice to meet all of you virtually. I think I'm feeling your energy through the chats and a lot of the emails I received last night and today, but thank you for being here. My path was different than David's, although David and I had a conversation and we have some overlapping connections and we've reconnected, but the one point in common is we both studied with Maxine Kuhlman. So So congratulations to Maxine Kumin for having created two poets
Yeah,
40
she
years
was Anne
later.
Sexton's best friend, and she was nice to us too.
Right. My path was this way. So my parents are Greek. I was sort of brought up in a Greek American home, steeped in Greek mythology. And my mother was a literature buff. And I think when I was a teenager, she was reading me constantly Khalil Gibran's The Prophet and a lot of sort of activist literature. And I had kind of harbored a secret love of writing, although when I went to Princeton, my eyes were wide open and I was trying to really figure out what I wanted to do. I was an architecture student. I loved architecture. It felt actually like a counterculture major at Princeton. My thesis advisor was Michael Graves, and I would go to the architecture school, which I'm sure many of you have been to, and it was kind of this chaotic environment, which was like a counterpoint to Princeton's very, Gothic formality, at least in my mind. So I realized a part of me was very, I'd say, counter tradition. So when I was at Princeton, I also trudged over to 185 Nassau Street as if it were like a little sin, and took creative writing classes with William Meredith, who's an esteemed poet, who was very influential to me just as my first professor, not knowing his, I guess, fame as a poet, Pulitzer Prize winner, and so forth. Maxine Kumin, of course, was a great supportive, I don't know, maybe maternal voice. I also studied fiction with Joyce Carol Oates, who was at Princeton. That was a legendary moment in my writing because she was extremely analytical. And I remember we were in a class of, I don't know, 8 or 9 students, and she asked us to read a chapter of Ann Tyler's great book, Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant. And we spent, I don't know, 4 months. It was like intensive psychotherapy, if you will, where 8 students were reading a chapter of this book and sharing our impressions, which were all, of course, extremely different. And it was really an amazing learning experience. So I took away from my Princeton experience a true love of writing, of contemporary writing. Probably like David, I was steeped in what we all learned, Shakespeare 101 and, Yeats and Shelley. And, we were steeped in a lot of classicism, but at Princeton, ironically, I was looking for modernism, actually in architecture and in writing. Then afterwards, my life spiraled in a different direction. I, became a businessman. I lived in Paris. I worked in the beauty industry, and I had an intense and successful business career, but the kind of soul in me was kept alive, where I was always just writing poetry over, I don't know, 35, 40 years. And then I decided during the COVID epidemic to sit down, look at all the poems I've written over my life and fashion them into a manuscript. And then I met the editors at Tupelo Press, and they published my first book. So that was sort of a, I don't know, serendipitous culmination of my very, I'd say, secretive writing career.
So, I think you earlier just said Maxine Kunin created 2 poets. Had either of you written poems before college? When was your first poem?
I don't know, David. I don't know. I think I was writing sort of missives or some kind, or the fledgling poems, but I had really, if I think back 13, 14 years old, I was more of a reader than a writer. I'd say it that way.
Yeah.
But I think I wrote my first poem actually at a real poem at a creative writing class at Princeton.
How about you, David?
My father had a poem that I wrote in 2nd grade about the snow, and it was in free verse, which I think was pretty radical for an 8-year-old. But I did that thing I think we all do in high school, writing poems of great meaningfulness, poems about feeling. But at the same time, I remember finding in a used bookstore a copy of Wallace Stevens' collected poems in hardcover. And I just read all of these. One of my teachers had given me a poem of his to read, and I devoured them. And he's like the most poetical poet around. I mean, there's a lot of other things too. An insurance executive from Hartford who just kept writing and writing. And so I poured over that book, and I did a horrible thing, which was to underline and comment on this hardcover classic book in pen. Don't ever do that, especially when you're 17. But I was writing in high school, you know, in that way where you have a meaning, a yellow highlighter moment of feeling. And I think Princeton allowed us to kind of be in that place of more complexity, of kind of not knowing of what you're going to write until it kind of occurs one way or another. Robert Frost said, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. So to be in a place of surprise and discovery, I think, is part of the things that at Princeton led us both into writing stuff that was worth reading and not just about snow.
So, you know,
One thing that occurs to me, like when we're teenagers, I think we're, you know, full of emotions and full of searching and discovery. And I think many young people approach poetry from a well of feeling and actually a well of great sensitivity. And what I learned as life went on is that much of great poetry is almost unfeeling, where you have to sort of step out of like almost an emotional lens and craft something that works in and of itself. It always amazes me when I took a great workshop with Nancy Schoenberger, who may be listening today, at the Academy of American Poets in New York in the 80s. And I remember I was in a class it wasn't a bunch of Princeton undergraduates. This was the cross section of society. And I would say 95% of the poets in the workshop were very troubled and very angry and upset. And they were going to this workshop as a form of expressing their feeling. And I learned from her that what they're expressing in writing is not necessarily poetry per se, but it's sort of the strands of poetry. And the poetry requires a lot of craft.
I felt that, but I have to say that the people, you know, sitting around in those weird classrooms at 185 were really good. Peter Melhado, I'll just do some name checks. Peter Melhado, some of you may know, was a terrific poet in our class. Liz Gold, Lucy Carter, class of 80, Terry Wrong, a bunch of really good people who didn't all necessarily move to become poets. And David Remnick was in classes with me. He went on to, you know, I think he's the editor of some lit magazine in New York. I'm not sure which one. But, you know, his claim to fame was that he'd gone to a concert at Rutgers and turned pages for Allen Ginsberg. That was the thing I knew David Remnick for before he went on to become, you know, a literary figure of a small magazine in the Condé Nast Empire. So we were good, I think. Had that emotion, but we had a lot of craft, I think, that was brought out. And I still remember poems by Peter, a number of these other folks too, who were in those classes. Some of you may know these same folks.
So tell us a little bit about your 2 new books. And I know you've read each other's, so it'll be very interesting to hear your respective thoughts. I know, you know, I found both of your works to be very intimate and in many cases relationship focused on all different types of close relationships. I don't know if that's what you had in mind.
I think, David, I think when we were speaking, we realized we had commonality and that we had, you know, grievance in our work, and we had references to our mother. We also had the commonality of being, you know, gay men and, you know, dealing with the path of being a gay man from the 80s to today. So I think we had that in common. It was serendipitous we met like this, but we realized we had that journey in common, which found itself in our respective books.
Yeah, I agree. You want to say more about that, Steve, and talk more about your book?
Yeah, sure. So the Oculus is the title refers to, of course, the famous piece of architecture. It didn't surprise myself, at least. I use a piece of architecture for the title, you know, of the Pantheon in Rome, where you're inside a dome and there's a giant oculus that you're looking out into the world with. But I think I chose the title because the idea of the subject of a sentence, and also the actual I, are sort of a way in which you're observing the world. And in the case of this book, a lot of what I was writing about was memory seen through the present, and like revisionist memory, and the blending of what really happened in the past versus how you see those same events in the present, and how they mesh. So there's never any real, I'd say, truth to the past, but for me, the Oculus was just a lot about, exploring, relationship to my mother in the last third of the book.
Yeah.
And then the second part of the book, and going backwards, is more my exploration of the world, having been someone who's lived, all over the world, basically. And then the first part is really just analyzing, the memory of feeling good and bad. So it's kind of, I suppose it's somewhat of a emotional book. But I always try to render the poetry very imagistic, and very and work on another level besides just feeling.
Yeah, I hear you. And I definitely felt that, Steve, in your book. And it's interesting to see how the poems clustered. There's a lot of pain in the book, especially in that first part. I was struck by that, just a lot of emotion, beautifully rendered, and then moving kind of through the world, and then arriving again at kind of the original place of the mother and the parents remembered. And I think that's, somebody said, maybe it was somebody like Galway Connell from Princeton, that all poems are really elegies, and maybe because they're all looking back, even if it's just to last week. And I think I've been in that space with my first book, Theory of Devolution, and then the second book, Clay, and then now this new book, Live in Suspense. And for me, I grappled with the title for a long time as I put the poems together to see how they connected. And the idea ultimately of living in suspense, which was a line in one of my poems. There's a poem I'm having where I'm over at a restaurant near London Terrace here in Chelsea, and I'm having dinner with someone, and I can tell that they're about to tell me something massive in their lives, and that will affect me as well. And I have no idea what it is. This really happened. But I was interested in that moment of before things really changed. And the last line of the poem is, I live in suspense. And that kind of brought the book together for me and ultimately became the title. This sense that I think we have, especially at our ages, of kind of waiting for the next mortal thing to happen. Here we are, we're pretty alive and vital. We have a lot of experience. We have a lot of love and grief in our lives. And what's going to happen next? We're kind of on this balance. We're kind of on a bridge, which is an image in my poems. So within that, I'm elegizing my mother, who died 20 years ago, who's a constant presence, and my father, who was an Episcopal priest and who died while I was writing this book, and who was a massive, presence. It was easy for me to confuse kind of God the Father with Dad the Father. So there's a lot in here grappling around faith and with him, and with the fact that he really liked living and didn't want to die. And there's a lot still about AIDS and HIV, which I think has been one of my main topics that crystallizes so much of what we're dealing with. And the book ideally is a journey for the reader, if you do in fact start on page 1, where the problems are set around all of this, the questions of endurance and living in suspense, and then kind of goes into an underworld, which may be something that we can talk about around classic issues, where things get harder and more grappling in the second part. And then ideally, there's some emergence and some resolution, some sense of what it means to live in suspense, and maybe even a little stealth Buddhism. My husband's a big Buddhist, Episcopal Buddhist, among other things. And I stay away from the practice exactly, but it kind of seeps in, it's in the air conditioning we share. So I'm hoping that book ends in a place. The last poem is called The World Without Me, and I'm hoping that there's some kind of rest in the suspense from that.
But David, when I read the book, as we talked about a little, I was struck by the art of metaphor and how you were using very compelling, disruptive images, which were a metaphor for grievance and for finding joy in the art in the state of suspension, which is grievance. And I found that that recurring theme, I think, brought the whole book together and made it a very thematic book. And why I think, for all the people listening today, it would be a great read. I do think that both books, Live in Suspense and The Oculus, in the whole kind of, panorama of poetry being published, is relatively accessible, which is probably, Catherine, an issue we should talk about too. I think you had in your questions about how do readers approach poetry, but I think these two books are, relatively accessible for people who are not aficionados of poetry.
Well, on that note, one thing I'm very curious about, you read each other's work. How do poets read poets? Did you read aloud? How did you do it?
I read it. I read it in my living room with a cup of coffee. I don't know. I don't make a distinction whether I'm reading someone I know's book, or I tend to just take the work at face value. Sometimes I think it's better to read work without any pre-existing knowledge of the poet and their history, because you're just appreciating the actual work on the page and the way it sounds in your mind. And you are raising an issue, Catherine. David and I also talked about this. Sometimes poetry read aloud has a different meaning and feeling than poetry you're actually reading on the page. And some poems lend themselves better to being read aloud, and others read to yourself.
Yeah, I think that's true. I've thought about this a lot. I think one of the real challenges of poetry is that it's often, unlike all the other arts, even the kind of more esoteric ones, it's largely experienced by its creators. Poets read other people's poetry, and so especially poetry books. A lot of us actually read a lot of poetry, but we may not go into a book from page 1 to page 80. We'll read the poems in the New Yorker, we'll read poems on the occasion of 9/11, we'll look for them for our weddings or our funerals. So I think there's actually a lot more poetry reading than we think. And I think about this a lot because there's no better way to stop a conversation at a party. When someone asks, what do? You tell them you're a poet. You might as well say, well, here's my bloody axe, or, here I am, I'm an insurance salesman and I'm interested in your second mortgage. I mean, it just stops the conversation, because I think we all, and I think Princeton and high school do this to us. We treat poetry, if we're not writing it, or if we're writing it, even if we are, as something that we need a magic decoder ring to actually understand. And that's, I think, really frustrating. Poets can encourage that sometimes, but they're not esoteric texts. They're not Kabbalistic. They're not hermetic. That's the Makash Hall word I'm looking for. They can be, but I don't think we have to approach them that way. And I think we all get our kind of defenses up, and I count myself in this, that we have to figure out what a poem means. There's a friend of, there's somebody on this chat right now who said to me senior year in Edwards Hall, why don't poets just say it? And this person was an English major who focused on the Victorian novel. And I won't say who they are, but they can identify themselves. And that was a revelation for me. There we were in the hallway, first floor Edwards Hall, talking about this. So I think the real challenge for poets and for those who want to read them is to just let a poem happen for you. Don't try to master it. And ideally, whether it's a collage poem or a more narrative or lyrical poem, a linear ones like I think Steve and I write, or something that's a little bit more so-called avant-garde, just let it happen. Don't feel you need to master it like a legal brief or a novel even. And I hope poets can invite that from readers, or for readers to think that way. And I hope readers can be more open to it, just to let it, just see how it makes you feel and what you get out of it, without having to feel complete mastery or comprehension of its codes and meanings.
But well, David, you're alluding to something we've experienced, which is the general public, let's say, who is not really into poetry per se, or not familiar with poetry. My view is many people expect poetry to be a narrative, to tell a story. Most people, I would say, in general, will think of poetry as a sort of expression of pain or expression of healing. These are kind of cliches that are many readers' expectations. And the truth is, the universe of poetry is so much more than that. And many poems are not about narrative. They're actually about sound. Sometimes they're about the visual interplay of words on a page. As David said, how they make you feel. It's actually letting yourself go into what the poem can mean for the reader, rather than try to, shoehorn a meaning you may think inside the poem. And really good poetry, I think, very successful poetry, I should say, I think is in the end very clear.
Mhm.
although it may be unexpected and it may be something, a reader has never felt or seen.
Yeah.
But, there are many avenues to appreciating poetry. And, I'm always encouraging people who, I don't know, who are reading like best-selling, torch
Yeah.
novels to like
Or
change their
literary stuff.
repertoire.
Yeah. Literary fiction. Yeah, I think people relate poetry either to visual art or music. I mean, those are the two sort of companion pieces. And with music, we don't demand meaning and understanding, even if they're lyrics. We allow it to happen. We listen to its form and its craft. And same with with visual arts. You see a painting, a Jackson Pollock painting, a modern painting, even a figurative one, and you let it happen without necessarily feeling that it has to be you have to have a yellow highlighter moment of understanding. But because poems are made of words and we're used to understanding words, I think we can kind of default to that notion of like, I got to get this. I got to write that paper for Alvin Kernan, dean of the graduate college for Shakespeare 101. We're doing 131, excuse me, and we're doing sonnets. And I think if we move away from that and treat poetry more like art, visual art or music, we may be a little more relaxed around it.
So I would challenge all the viewers to go to an exhibition of Mark Rothko and just stare into a Rothko painting for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And just analyze what you're thinking and seeing. And that might be a very shorthand way of approaching reading a poem.
Well, so I think, David, you said, let's let it happen 3 times now. I think that's the magic segue to, you both promised that you'd read for us today. We'd love to hear.
So Catherine, are you asking us to read? Okay.
I am.
All right. David, do you want to go first?
I can go first, or we can have an Alphonse and Gaston moment where we each invite.
You want to flip a coin?
Let's go in reverse alphabetical order.
Okay, that's good. All right. So I think that means I go first. I'm going to read a poem called The Trolley. I'm not sure, Catherine, this is a poem I had given you before, so bear with me, but it just sort of popped up on my screen.
Yeah, no, you did. Please.
Did I? Okay. All right, good. I'm waiting for my chimes to end here because it's exactly noon in my home. So this poem is called The Trolley, and this is just a moment in the past that was captured of someone who's in San Francisco. So The Trolley. Autumn 1963. I climbed to the top of Nob Hill, to the corner of Broadway and Powell, straddled a pair of gleaming silver tracks, reverberating under my worn sneaker soles, feeling the trolley approaching from the valley. I heard the whirring and the metal intensify like a woman about to come, felt a dull heat rise through my socks, up the contours of my calves until they were numb. And why I would not move, I do not know. I wanted to discuss this with myself, but had little time as the trolley approached slowly as a stranger. Our meeting was preceded by the clanking of wheels, echoing down the glittery plateau of San Francisco Bay. And off the gridded sea of blue windows filled with flows of clouds. I heard the trolley lurch forward, then roll back as passengers jumped off its sides, catching itself like a lock closing, so not to descend back where it came from, inching again forward at full tilt as the track hot beneath my feet started to groan, softly first, like a deep longing or private heartache, until the maroon metal roof, glistening clean, broke the crest of the hill, and the tracks went whistling, heart swelling as the trolley slowed with a sense of long deliberation toward a verdict, finally coming to a stop to meet me, take me, this toiling soul suspended in time, wanting someplace to go.
Wow.
Thank you for that. You can feel the trolley movement, a lot of movement in architectural detail inside the feeling.
Yeah. You nailed the landing, Steve, on that one.
Yeah, my editor said it was a Bukowski type of poem.
Yeah. Would you read the last couple lines again? Just
Yes.
Here where we
Yes.
land.
I heard the trolley lurch forward, then roll back as passengers jumped off its sides, catching itself like a lock closing so not to descend back where it came from, inching again forward at full tilt as the track hot beneath my feet started to groan, softly first like a deep longing or private heartache, until the maroon metal roof, glistening clean, broke the crest of the hill, and the tracks went whistling, heart swelling as the trolley slowed with a sense of long deliberation toward a verdict, finally coming to a stop to meet me, take me, this toiling soul suspended in time, wanting someplace to go.
I love that. Shiver at the
Thank
ending
you.
there. It's so much a trolley. It's so, visual and smelly and loud, and yet it kind of resonates so much into meaning and significance.
Yeah, I think the sense of the poem was someone simply wanting to be lost, actually, and wanting to find something else. If I look at that, sort of
Yeah.
as a broader statement, but it captured this moment where someone's waiting for a trolley.
Yeah. And it's kind of open-ended, it doesn't, come down with doesn't snap shut like a jewel box the way some poems can.
Right.
It's that seems, I think, kind of where, well, I relate to it a little bit because it feels like where I am in my life a little bit now with trying more openness, maybe having let go of some of my, the notions that guided me when I was younger, and to try to be in a place of more less certainty and more curiosity about what's happening and where I'm going to go. So I've been interested a lot in what it means to be a poet over 50. And I think you're speaking to that,
Thank you.
If we were the class of 2019, you'd be hearing different poems from us.
I think so. We could talk later about what people are writing now versus then.
Yeah.
An interesting subject.
Yeah.
Well, so David, your comments really seem to kind of reflect this title you've chosen, Vision and Revision. Or am I mistaken? But I know you guys took a lot of time to very carefully pick the words for the title. How does that relate to what we're discussing?
Well, I'll just speak for myself. I think it may speak to some of the issues around writing out of history and a place in history, personal and cultural. And to me, I think it's about a backward glance or traveled roads, as Whitman put it, that we are a little more retrospective now. We are kind of revising what we may have done earlier in our lives with a different angle on it, from a place maybe of less striving, of more awareness of death, of 30 or 40 reunions from now, and all of those things that make us maybe revise, re-see, and have fresh visions around things that are akin to where we were. We're not different people, but we're in different places. So it seemed kind of personal, I think, for me. Steve may have a different feel, and also kind of larger about poetry. And all poems revise other poems too. Every poem is an after poem, written after, or sometimes literally another poem. So you're part of a line around poetry, even as you're a part of a line in your own life.
Yeah, I think David, those comments are very poignant. I think when you're older, and let's say an older poet, you have less risk actually, because you're speaking more from the heart, more with the experience of all sorts of pain and joy and such a panoply of experience in life, and that's a lot to draw on as a poet. And I also think that as you get older, the poems are a conversation between the poem and you and the poem, and then the poem to the reader, of course. But I sense in both our works, Live in Suspense and The Oculus, we are talking to ourselves and there's the readers witnessing the conversation we are having with ourselves about our struggles and our need for reconciliation, especially at this point in life.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I feel that. I mean, one of the things I think I feel, and I hope others listening feel, is a greater sense of freedom. I was at an English department awards lunch a few years ago at City College where I teach. And I kind of defaulted to thinking about what it would be like to be a full professor there. And I thought, I'm not that, I'm not, I do my editing. There is nothing in this room that I want. And I felt wonderfully kind of free of the striving of academe and to some degree, the striving of book publishing. We have the gift, I think, at this point of more agency in a lot of ways and less attachment. We don't, our sense of tenure is different. And I think that changes how we write, how we read probably, and how we live, ideally in positive ways as we, move to a different place in our lives.
David, I don't know if you experienced this. So during, let's say, the decades, as I was getting older, growing up, writing, when I was very young, of course, because I was such a voracious reader, as all poets probably are, of course, I was benchmarking what I'm writing versus other writers. And, you ask yourself, oh, well, can I write a poem like Robert Frost? Can I write a poem like Elizabeth Bishop? Can I write a poem like, so you're very, especially with people you admire whose work resonates with you, a poet will naturally emulate and naturally almost be a sub voice for that voice.
Yeah.
And I think one of the interesting processes of a poet as they get older is actually, it's a cliche, but it's finding their own voice. Like, who really are they, even versus the person that you admire, who inspires you. And that's why at this particular moment in time, as I presume we're both 65-ish, we have the freedom to really be who we are in our writing.
Yeah. I think that's true. I think there's also ageism and a lot of other stuff that goes on in our world and, our adjacent worlds. But there is that freedom and a different kind of sense of things that I think can be really powerful to have a different kind of agency and to find your own voice. I mean, I think that's something I try to encourage in my writers, my students and my authors, that they have to be distinctive. And it's something I look for in myself too. It's so easy to be overwhelmed by all the great writers out there. Flannery O'Connor talked about how she didn't really want to read William Faulkner. They were both Southern writers because his great freighter would, just overwhelm her little boat. And sometimes I can feel that too, like, let's stay away from Galway Canal or some of these others. But you want to the more you sound like yourself, and the more you can kind of own that, the better. And sometimes it can be a real mind game to put yourself, alongside Galway Canal and W.S. Merwin, just to name two Princeton poets, not much less everybody else. You have to have your own little boat, even if T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland is still going to be dominated in McCosh.
Well, I guess we're all a lot of little boats, and there are a few freighters in the harbor, right? So.
And your comps, didn't we all have comps senior year of some kind? Didn't we have a general exam? I seem to remember, we had some, along with the senior thesis, we had, something else.
So David, with you both talking about boats, I thought we were going to segue into I think that you want to read for us.
Yeah, I'm actually going to hold off on that one, I think.
Okay.
Read one a little bit more like Steve's. This poem also occurs outdoors, but on a different coast in New York City. I spend a lot of time, just walking the streets. And I think it's relatively narrative, so I think you'll get the sense of the encounter in it. And it's called I with No Rights in This Matter. All day I have been looking for my children, who I know will never exist. I do not find them in the forms of my students, though I would pluck them out of traffic as if my genes were speaking. Nor are my children my nieces and nephews, whose blood bears resemblance to my own, in whom I echo. They have parents to belong to, and I borrow them. Tangled amid the toddlers and strollers, the elementary kids skipping beside their dads to school, The 10-year-olds walking boldly alone past the chanting man and the compost bin, the sullen or screeching teens, all angry angles, their parents, practiced men and women who once as babies might have sat on my lap and now run enterprises. I am where among them? My non-procreation seemed the condition of my freedom. I who swept from man to man, who lived like a boy, who felt like no one's father, not even his own, who in the prime of his sperm suspected his semen was deadly, who saw men of a generation give birth to death, his ejaculations dead ends, ciphers of surges and love, who can't run fast enough to catch the fading train. Still, I feel in the fork of my genes those millions I produce even now, however warped and bent, clamoring to make half the child I will not make, striving inside me as I try to bear the mostly straight world stranger children, offspring owned by no one really, amazing in their incipient decay, stray as leaves and already scattering, running to the risk of the intersection. All of them, my letters to God on the street. I let them go ahead of me.
Beautiful. David, in that poem, do you feel a lot of that came from the struggle with being gay?
I think so. I mean, certainly so many of my poems are, grapple with, what it means to be a person of my generation. And I think above and beyond issues of AIDS and HIV, which so shaped all of us, I think, and definitely, LGBTQ people, there's the question I've had and thought about for a long time about how to find value in your own life. And I think a lot of us find it, partly at least, through our children and the idea of children. And so the interesting thing for me was to think if queer people don't have children as much, and certainly they do a lot and always have and are doing even more, then what are other ways in which you find value and meaning? And I've defined that, I think, along the idea of generativeness. What do we generate? How can we be generative in our lives and create that value, along with or perhaps instead of procreation? And that word and that idea and that kind of valuation for all of us was something I've been thinking about for a long time, even as I was, thinking and missing sometimes the idea of having my own kids, that opportunity, had gone by. So the idea also of letting go, that idea of being a procreator, being an actual parent, letting the kids just do their thing, and seeing value in that, in the freedom they have and the distinction between me and them as a figure, also felt ultimately valuable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautifully expressed. I think one of the struggles I've had, I wouldn't say I had struggles being gay or being accepted as gay, but more, I'd say in the last 5 years as I've gotten older, you ask yourself, I do not have children. I probably many times wanted to, but as a gay man, who's married and has been in, a relationship for over 20 years, it always strikes me what is my legacy? And I think gay people who don't necessarily have families with lots of children per se have the particular challenge of defining their legacy without children.
Yeah.
And what is that?
Yeah.
I have lots of nieces and nephews. I have a very big extended family, whom I've shown a lot of interest in.
Yeah,
but I still
right.
think that let's call it the straight couple with many children has a different type of sense of legacy than gay people, even today.
I absolutely feel that. And I think we all share the same imperative in some ways, which is to increase the amount of love in the world, increase the amount of life in the world, and to bring that valuation to it, whatever our circumstances, I think is one way to kind of define us and define us at this stage in our lives as well.
Right.
When you've both written eulogies to mothers and fathers, so this parent-child relationship is clearly something that's been very influential. Why is this so empowering in your writing?
Well, Catherine, I always try to get away from my parents, but I guess it's impossible. So, they're still in my writing. And I love both my parents in different ways. I have a poem I'll read, since that's a segue into another poem that I wrote, which is, I'd say, somewhat of an elegy to my mother. I don't really know why. I can't say there's a definitive answer, except I would just say that parents, of course, can play a very big role in anyone's life. And somehow, if you're a very intense writer, they'll find their way into your writing. I don't know, David, if you have any thoughts on that before I find my poem here.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're kind of inescapable. I was, thinking about my parents and my graduation, all, how they, dealt with Princeton, how they were, so proud I was there. What, the presumption of where I would go to college, the sacrifices they made, to pay my way through. I worked at the Firestone Library and Interlibrary Loan every Friday from 1 to 5 p.m. and then and then Tuesday and Thursday as well. And I did that, and they really sacrificed, and they were powerful presences. And I think there's also a lot to say that I'll defer maybe for a minute about our particular generation of parents and how they relate to us, particularly the mothers, but fathers as well, and how parents today are somewhat different. And there are things to say, I think, about what our parents brought to us that informs our writing and just informs our lives.
But I'm going to read a poem called The Apron. This was published in Plain Songs. And this was actually the first poem I showed my publisher, Jeffrey Levine, who may be on. The Apron. I am wearing my mother's apron I found on the inside of the cupboard door, aged to a peppery beige. The shock of it hanging on a nail, slump-shouldered, as if she had just slipped out in a rush to die as she was making stewed lamb and greasy potatoes and crispy phyllo rudders through me. She likely left the candles burning on the perfectly set table, tines of forks glinting like the tiny knots of silver crosses sewn into the bishop's robe that would one day cordon her rose-sprinkled grave.
Mm.
Now at her seat at the head of the table preside shakers of rice, coupled like dolls, and bowls of rubber grapes. I tie the belt loop around my broadening waist, filling out her form to prepare the meal she never finished. I pat down the crumpled lap of shorn linen, marked by raised red embroidery of the word mom in script. Cheap sentiment, yes, but I ride a passing longing, feeling the soft edge of the page she thumbed as I decipher a recipe for lemon soup she wrote in pencil, smudged to a sheen, marred by a few dry stains. Ironic how this apron covers as it cloaked me once before, the summer of 1957, over the flow of steaming casseroles and sisters' muted screams to cheers of ball games and activists for civil rights in the blistering TV set, as she carried me inside her through the battered rooms whose wounds I grew to love, as I set this plate of hot rice to swinging bells of incense, Kyrie eleison 3 times, to the timer clicking shut.
Thank you.
Steve, that's gorgeous.
Thank you.
Again, just very visual. That you're in the kitchen wearing the apron with you.
Well, this poem, I would say I was conscious of writing a poem that was extremely focused on the apron, on a physical object, and impart into it this story and this feeling without it becoming too much of a sentimental poem. And I always, for me, the poem worked because it was sort of dryly sentimental, and in the end, it was very visual. actually not an easy poem to write for me.
Yeah. Stanley Plumley, who was a teacher for me and for some of us, had a line, and it may not have been original with him, that sentimentality is loving something more than God does. And that's one of those lines that he pronounced, this big bearded bear of a man who was not that Princeton-y in a lot of ways. He was more, earthy than a lot of our teachers. But I've thought about that idea, and the kind of, the sentimentality can be a preciousness, and that what you're writing, it arises out of a true place and has some real complexity in it. And the very image of inhabiting that same apron, is just so unparaphrasably powerful and emotional. And then how you work on that to make it more complex and, keep sentiment in it, even as you're, not, making it cheap, making it easy for us. And I think that's pretty great as we, I think we appreciate that in poems and in art too, when we work for the truer feeling.
I think mentality is a double-edged sword, right? Because I've seen in a lot of workshops and, young new writers, their immediate instinct is to resort to cliches, which are very sentimental, but in reality, they're not real. They're just sort of like rehearsed, like emotional shorthand. And I think really good poets can achieve sentimentality in a very unique and profound way. And it's hard to do. We all grow up with the noise of mass media, cliched phrases, and we carry that into our psyche. And poets have the particular challenge of, writing from a place of truth and discarding all that.
Yeah. And I think from a place of conflict, I have my students write love poems, but I do it really late in the semester after we've written parent poems and things. And I say, you've got to find, even if you're writing a poem about how much you love your partner, that poem is about the risk of losing them, through whatever way. There's a reason you're writing it, to cement that love, to do something. So I think, if you're writing and reading out of a place of trying to figure something out, as opposed to kind of just celebrating it easily, you're gonna earn that emotion and that truth. Sometimes I think we want to avoid conflict in writing and other things, and I think working through it is just a much more powerful. It's going to make more powerful experience for the reader as they're on the.
Sounds like living in suspense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
We've got a few more moments. We'd love to hear another poem from you, David, if you'll read for us again.
Okay, well, I'm going to try to do something a little different, and I hope this will work. I'm going to try to screen share a poem. Let me just say before I try that, my book is filled with elegies for both parents. My father was an Episcopal priest, as I've said, but had, I think, kind of a questioning idea about all the precepts and things he'd learned, from birth, really, because his father was a minister as well. And my mother had something of an existential notion as well. And one thing I've tried to do for both of them, now that they're gone, is to imagine what heaven would be, what would be their resting place. And for my mother, I have actually kind of a failed poem where I imagined her being in a greenhouse. She loved plants. I thought that would be her place, some solarium, where she would sit and do her crossword puzzles, and I would join her somehow. And for my father was a fisherman. He had great notions. But he loved getting away from the church that summer month when he could actually forget everything, forget being in service to others, and be his own person. And he bought he had a large kind of problematic boat that he kept in the garage, and then he had a little one he loved, a little green boat. It was very small, and that's where I kind of imagine him. And if I can do this, I'm gonna share the screen so you can see what the poem looks like. Can people see that?
Nice. Yeah.
Great.
It looks like a vase.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, you'll see.
Okay.
It's a concrete poem, I guess, is what you would call it. And it's the only one that I maybe ever written. His craft. For $50, my father bought a tiny green boat, some 8 feet long, seafoam, color of a lily pad, squared off at the bow, snub at the stern, unmade to slice into water, built for no speed, a craft sturdy on the stream, a donkey of a vessel, but willing, and with a curved, nearly flat bottom, where he could spread out his tackle and have lunch, a boat to sit and float in, a boat that could take his bulk, where from his seat he could cast and reel in sunnies and perch he dreamed all winter, or not catch them, be by himself or with maybe a single sun board in the bow. If his body was a vessel, it was this boat, near solitary with its stalk of motor, resistant to its own oars, but with mulish momentum, sliding across the tidewater, at home where salt met fresh, the brack, fit for a man of mixed currents, a man almost potable but bitter, tidal, rife with weeds, ebb and rise, and anchored. Here he is near the reeds, his arms tanned, hair misty in the sun, still wearing his suspenders, his shirt white as an angel's chest, casting, not caring what the worm attracts, beyond hunger, at home in the fishless afternoon of what his father would call a day in the open, his wife reading on the far shore in the shade, his sons in sight on the dock, forever a man up in a cove at the edge of the bay, sheltered, the river Styx a home, the boat his harbor.
Very beautiful.
So it took a lot of effort to figure out how to make this look like a boat that you really can't row. And then when the book was published, went into print, I thought, oh gosh, what's it going to look like when it's not in typeface anymore? So fortunately, it kind of gets the shape of the boat, the vase, this little thing that would fit on the roof of the station wagon. So,
David, what I love about the poem, it's so rooted in hard imagery and actually simple sentence structure, yet it maintains this long narrative that like communicates much more deeply than what the apparent facts are saying. It's quite moving is the word. I think very good. Congratulations.
Thanks a lot.
Very moving. And the when you said the line about him being almost potable, the boat suddenly also looks like a funerary urn.
Yeah.
I mean, thank you so much for really, I think raising our appreciation for what can go into a poem.
Thanks. Thank you.
So with that, time has flown. We are actually at 12:31. And I am going to look at our questions from our audience now. And there is a comment in the chat that I want to share before I do that from David Zung. And earlier, I laughed or smiled at a very inappropriate moment. And it's because what leaped up on my screen is the comment that I never thought I would hear the names Don Rumsfeld, Keats, and Yeats in the same sentence. I think there's a poem in there somewhere. So, and David also has a more serious comment. Hi, Stelios. I was in the same architecture class with you, and Michael Graves was my thesis advisor as well. You were a shouting caps, fabulous designer, and had a sensitive and nuanced eye. In some ways, I'm not surprised you ended up in the beauty industry. Can you talk a little bit about the influence of your architecture training on your life, work, and poetry?
Thanks, David. David, nice to hear from you. Oh my God, blast from the past. I think that's true. I think, strangely, architecture, it seems like it had this kind of like life of non sequiturs, but I think it's actually not the case. Architecture, of course, is about form, about history, about functionality. I see so many similarities, parallels between architecture and writing and poetry. And interestingly, when I went into the beauty industry, I realized a lot of the beauty industry is about design. It's probably about poetry. I mean, a lot of my career, I worked for L'Oréal in France and Coty, a lot of French beauty companies, and a lot of my work was designing products and manufacturing products, bringing them to market, creating ad campaigns. So there is a similarity. I'd say the big difference, of course, is the beauty industry is ultimately about money and commerce and capitalism. And I'm not sure architecture is, and certainly poetry isn't. But yeah, there are a lot of similarities. My third book, which no one has really seen except for one or two editors, I write a lot about the beauty industry, the crazy beauty industry, by the way. That's another podcast, Catherine, about, celebrities and lipstick and sex and intrigue and all these other things. But I do find that industry quite fascinating because it's a huge economic engine and people are always buying beauty products, whether the economy goes up or down. The economy goes up, they buy more expensive beauty products. The economy goes down, they buy more cheap beauty products, but it's always growing. But yeah, David, there's a lot of parallels between architecture, which is very aesthetic, and writing and the beauty industry. So those three things kind of have been leitmotifs in my life.
So next question is for you, David, from Marcia Zuckerman. And Marcia writes that she's interested in the relationship between poetry and mental health. And you made reference to angst-ridden teenage poetry. A psychiatrist that Marcia knows told her that Anne Sexton's psychiatrist prided himself on suggesting that she write poetry, which she did very well, but nevertheless took her own life. Can you comment on whether, in your experience, writing poetry has been good for health, bad, or some combination of both?
Whoa, Marcia, thank you for that. There's a lot in this. I think when we talk about poetry, I think we're really talking about poetries. There are all different kinds of styles of poetry, forms and modes, and also different reasons for poetry to exist. And poetry therapy is actually a thing, a growing field where writers who are therapists or therapists who also write can work with people to use poetry to articulate and help people move through. Some poets really resist that notion, I think, because poetry and suicide have been associated so long. There was a professor, and Marcia, you may know more about this than I, named, I want to say Nancy Andreessen, who was at Iowa when I was, who posited that there was a real correlation between completed suicide and writing poetry. And this deeply, deeply pissed off the poets at the Iowa Writers Workshop, who were very much invested in their middle-class lives and their swashbuckling notions of themselves. And they did not want to be typed, as suicidal. And there was a real reaction, I think, including among women poets, to kind of the Sylvia Plath and Sexton model. These writers had killed themselves, just a decade or two before. So that kind of association is one that I think people resist because of that. Even if there may be some science behind it, a correlation, if not a causation. For me, poetry is just so clarifying. To read it, absolutely, and then to write it. And in reading it, there's just this wonderful sense of communication, of solidarity. James Baldwin has a line, and I'm going to paraphrase it badly, that you grow up and you think you're the only person in the world, as you're growing up, who ever felt this thing and that thing, and that you're utterly, entirely alone, and no one has ever felt what you felt before. And then you read. And I think, reading is not the only way, obviously, to do that, but for poetry and just in general, for that sense of community, reading is a very solitary act. It's the only art that isn't group, really, in a lot of ways. You do it one-on-one. And that's a really intimate connection I think we have with the reader and the page. It's truly intimate. And for the writer, it can be really powerful, but I think it can be truly sustaining for the reader. And I don't think we read necessarily to be therapized, but I think that's almost an indirect way of that connection is a way of feeling sustained and supported and enlightened. And sometimes it can be really kind of, a practical application. And I see my students doing this all the time, working through stuff on the page, whether it's, gender transition or love or meaning. I have a bunch of bothered young men in my classes who really are trying to figure out their lives, and poetry is helping them do that, as is prose. And it's interesting to see how they're reaching out to connect, even as they're struggling with their own truth and identities. Marcia, we can talk more about this too at some point. Marcia lived across the hall from me in Edwards, so.
Steve, do you have anything you want to add to that one?
I think there's a little bit of a kind of cliche narrative of this relationship between suicide and writing. The tortured writer. I'm not sure, statistically it would hold water that poems or poets have a higher rate of suicide than the general population. I would hope not. I would say the issue of health, though, I do think poetry is a very inspiring art, probably like many art, which I would believe just improves anyone's health, mental and physical. I think to have a life where you're writing or painting or creating anything and enjoying what you do, and it's a self-affirming type of activity, can only be a positive. I see it that way. I mean, I have had moments, David and I talked about, like, the addiction to poetry, like we're in the middle of a manuscript, like sometimes I wake up in the morning, I like run to my laptop because I was so excited about a poem I was working on the night before and was dying to see it again. And you get into these moments of like euphoria and struggle, working on refining poetry and finishing writing. Then you're doing something that has gives you a deep sense of fulfillment. So I think any type of writing that comes from the heart that's looking for truth can only improve someone's mental health and physical health.
I think that's true. And I would flip that, Steve, or expand it into reading. And I think there's been a study, and some attendees here, some participants may know more about this than I, but there was, I think, a recent study that actually reading and interacting with literature made for greater mental health and happiness. And I think in a world where we talk of careerism at a very early age, including, at the best at Ivy League universities from the beginning, to kind of remind people that happiness is also going to come through the connection with reading, through literature, with that association, I think is something to tell our kids and everybody else.
David, the problem, I totally agree with you. I remember one summer I read recently an old book, Pearl Buck's The Good Earth, which I'm sure many of us, it was one of these highly engrossing novels, to the point where I was like living in the novel. I think I forgot I forgot eating, I forgot, seeing friends, and I was engrossed, and I was so happy. But what saddens me today, like when I travel, is the amount of, we see it, but we see young people in their phones. Like it's the digital world. And I ask myself, do people really read books? I think there are people buying books, but I think the danger is the consumption of literature and reading is in other forms. And I'm not sure that form gives us the kind of health that we're talking about as a book does.
I worry about that too. And I'm hoping one thing about this phase of life, or when I finally kind of retire some, is that I'll be the way I was again when I was 14. I think we all were this way. It's a rainy day here in New York. And if I were 14, I'd be, curled up with, maybe the Brothers Karamazov, or a thriller, or a political novel, or, Travels with Charlie by John Steinbeck. And I don't do that anymore. I mean, I do it for money, but, and as an editor, but I'm hoping we can all do that. And I would say it's not just young people on their phones all the time, it's old people. You got to watch out for the person in the walker on 8th Avenue, who's looking at their phone and pushing themselves down the street. So
this is a chord that is clearly being struck for others. Nancy Herkness asked a question, David, in your teaching of young writers, what differences do you see between them and yourself as a young writer? Clearly we've just talked about one.
Oh yeah. There's a lot, I think, going on. I think in MFA writing and in writing in general, for fiction, nonfiction, memoir, there's a much more sense of having to do it fast and well, and a much more sense of having to build a career. Writers like Ann Tyler, who you read, Steve, with Joyce Carol Oates, had 5 kind of flops before she finally had books that succeeded. Same with John Irving. And now I think, writers are really aware that they've got to hit big, and soon have something that's sustainable, to have a series of readers. And that the hill is much steeper, I think, in that regard now, and they're aware of that. Also, the whole tenure world has basically disappeared. The idea when I was at Iowa was, you went to Iowa and you published a couple books, and then you became a professor at Oklahoma State and you were set for life. And that doesn't happen that much anymore. And with writers of popular writing, I think that's also the case. It's that we have a much more winner-take-all world in the arts in general, I think, and that makes it harder for the flowers to bloom, from those few big trees, and writers kind of know that now a lot. Nancy, I'd love to hear your experience on all of this too. We can talk.
Nancy, congratulations on all your books, by the way.
Yeah, you're
really fantastic. I know you can't talk back, but I think we've all been following your career.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so building on the earlier, Steve, you talked about writing a poem in the style of ... Semi-serious question from Martha. Have you played with Chat GPT, compose a poem in the style of either of you?
It's very funny, Marcia. It's funny you're raising that question. Pardon, I have chimes in this room, so hopefully you can hear me. This week, I've been having this sort of, I don't know, like existential crisis, because this week in particular, in my work, like 4 or 5 times, people in my company have come to me. I mean, this is not a non sequitur, by the way, and said, "Oh, Steve," I'm the CEO of a company. They're like, "Don't worry, I'll do this. I'm going to go to the chat bot and they'll do it for us." This happened this week 4 times. And whether it's writing a press release or doing a planning schedule or writing a letter to someone, and it fundamentally bothered me. And I actually wasn't sure how to react to employees in their 20s telling me this, because they were telling me this as if it's very natural that they would go to this chat bot who would do something for them instead of them doing it themselves. It's like people can't add in their head anymore, right? So, Marcia, I would unequivocally say I won't ever go to a chatbot to do anything for me. I actually would be afraid what I would see. And I don't know. I haven't been able to process this whole chatbot thing. I saw some crazy news program yesterday of a woman who voluntarily gave up her identity to chatbots, and now her identity is off on its own, like recreating a life for her and making her miserable. So it's like the worst sci-fi movie imaginable. So my answer would be no.
Yeah.
And, I think we have to figure out what's going to happen.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, chatbot writes really bad poetry. So if Steve, you should do this. Ask the chatbot to say, "Chatbot, please write a poem in the style of Stelios Mormoris." It will do it, and it will rhyme, and it will be something that Hallmark would reject for, reasons of treacle and honey and sentiment. But that's going to change, and it's an issue in classrooms, certainly, where people are too clean and too good and have botted themselves up. And it's going to be an issue in book publishing and in your business as well, where
Yeah.
authors may be doing original stuff, but a lot of the business of writing catalog copy or doing other things is going to be automated, at least in early drafts. And we're going to lose a lot of jobs from it. But
Yeah, I
it's
was going to say this will affect the employment rate. I
yeah,
think.
it will. It's
Yeah.
also, I think, and this is talked about a little, a copyright issue, because chatbot is getting all of this information by stealing from websites, from appropriating. And, I'm no lawyer like, Catherine, but I think it's a real issue just about, the right for anyone to their own content. And I'm hoping we kind of, beat this about the head a little bit around that question.
That is particularly interesting, especially when now you see some of these suits where now I can't think of who it is that is being sued by the estate of Marvin Gaye because there are some
right.
words, that's I think the analog to what you're talking about. So yeah. Very interesting. And since Nancy can't speak on here, there's also something else she's interested in that I'll share with you. Nancy also worked with Maxine Kumin and Stanley Kumitz and Stanley Plumley. And Maxine was her second semester thesis advisor. And she says fondly, the first person who made her feel like a real writer and was interested in more of your perspectives, both of you, from working with these three individuals.
Well, I love Maxine Kumin's work. I remember I had this book, Our Ground Time Will Be Brief, I believe, which was a book, I think it was so dog-eared. I read it over and over. So I always admire her writing as being very fresh and very heartfelt, extremely well-crafted. And she struck me as someone who was, I said earlier in this podcast, she was very maternal and a real nurturing teacher. And she did teach craft well. I remember actually she gave a poetry reading about Princeton in McCosh Hall, I believe. I think it's McCosh 101, was that the big? And I remember the whole audience was mesmerized by her reading, which showed me that the speaking of her poetry was so powerful in a way more than on the written page. And I would say, Nancy and everyone, that she somehow had this type of very authentic aura. So yeah, she had a big influence on my life, but on my writing. And I also appreciated she was just such a supportive, teacher beyond just being a great poet.
Yeah. She was the second reader on my thesis and remarked how she didn't like poems about poetry, which is something every young poet does. And I had a few of them in my senior thesis. So I've never written one of those since. Thank you, Maxine Kumin. No more reflexive poetry. She was wonderful. She was such a tough ass person. And again, kind of a little, of an antidote to some of the kind of stuffier folks who were, full professors at Princeton in the English department and elsewhere. She was tough. She was a horsewoman, New England poet, kind of a female Robert Frost. I had Anne Sexton, who survived. She has an amazing poem about inheriting Anne Sexton's jacket, which is pretty amazing. And at that same reading, which I actually think, Steve, was in the Art Museum auditorium.
Oh, maybe. Yeah, wrong. That's right.
She had a line.
You remember this? Yeah, incredible.
Yeah, it may have been one of McCosh 101,
yeah.
But I seem to remember Darkness. Joyce Carol Oates read there too, which was a little wild. But she had a line in a poem that I still remember, and it was so radical to hear from a woman, especially. It was a love poem, and it was about how after lovemaking for the man, the prince becomes a frog. I was like, wow, a woman writer has written about sex and the male penis in that way. But she had that kind of snap and attitude. And I thought, wow, a prince becoming a frog as a metaphor for postcoital male presence has never before been discussed in art museum auditorium, unless it was the Statue of David or something. So she was great.
Any reminiscences on Stanley Kunitz?
Yes. So Stanley Kunitz was, I think, my view of him was more cantankerous, like introverted, brilliant writer. I met him once actually in Provincetown separately. Um, he, I actually, in a weird way, he kind of scared me. I'm so young. Because at that point, when I had studied with him, I had more awareness of like who he was as a writer. But I made another amazing writer. And anyone watching this podcast should get his, I think, magnus opus of his collected works. He's such a great 20th century writer of American poetry. But I thought the world of him. Although, you always realize that people's works, or the written work, is disassociated from from the poet's personality.
Yeah.
And those are two different narratives, usually.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't know him at Princeton. I met him afterward, actually. But I just put in the chat an amazing older man poem called "The Layers" by him.
Oh, beautiful! Love this.
And it's we all should read it, because I won't give away the ending, but it's about change and vitality through one's lifetime. So click on that link and read it later. He lived to be like 101. He was just a tough, bird, and very generous in a lot of places, and I'm sure a challenging personality.
So what are you guys reading now? What do you read for fun?
Well, my publisher, Jeffrey Levine, if he's out there, hello, Jeffrey, said I should read more. So we had a conversation, I was stuck rereading all the poets I like, who wouldn't, and all the writers I like. So I'm reading, all the current big poets, Natalie Diaz, post-colonial love poem, and I just read Jericho Brown's A Tradition, Ada Limon, some great books. Troy Derricott is a poet I really admire. Joy Harjo. These are, so I'm reading a lot of this excellent contemporary, if I could use that word, poetry. And I'm realizing that in American culture, while I lived in France most of my life, which is probably relatively more educated than the United States, different linguistic traditions for poetry, of course. But what's amazing to me in the United States, in spite of all the, societal crisis and political polarization and, capitalist extremes, what's amazing to me is how many writers there are, and probably readers. And there is this undercurrent, I think, a huge flourish of poetry going on, I think, even since the COVID epidemic. And I find it very enriching in a way that there's so much good writing. I would say, Catherine, David, one of the things I feel is a lot of the poetry is political and is about, channels of talking about parts of American society that have been discriminated against or not finding equality, and has a certain sort of flavor of righteousness in the writing, and it's galvanizing a lot of writing in the US today. But that's what, Catherine, that's what I've been reading. And I was scared to read all this because I was thinking, oh my God, this is going to be so confusing to my mind with all this new energy, but I've been enjoying it.
How about you, David?
Well, a lot of stuff. First, though, I'll just say that I think the Kunitz poem I put in the chat would only be for the panelists. So the poem I was referring to, you can look it up yourself, is called "The Layers." So Stanley Kunitz, "The Layers" is the one that I was referring to, the great older person poem about life change. I'm reading a lot of the same people you're reading, Steve. Jericho Brown, Natalie Diaz, Ada Limon, our poet laureate, is amazing. Again, a kind of great poet to start with. There's a poet I think you would like who has and something may already know of her. She has a memoir that just hit the Times list, and she gave me a blurb for my book and consulted with me on it. Maggie Smith. She has a wonderful poem called "Good Bones."
Good Bones, love it.
And she, and the title of her poetry book is that. And she has a memoir of her divorce, which is takes a line from that poem called "You Could Make This Place Beautiful." And she's, I think, another great poet for us to kind of begin, to just read in pleasure and read and Google and read. Maggie Smith, not the same as the British actress. There's a lot of great political poetry out there, some of it righteous, but poetry has kind of moved onto the streets. And a lot of us, I think, feel more imperative to connect our writing to the world as it is. There's eco poetry going on right now, for example.
A lot of eco poetry,
yeah, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah.
And there's a sense too of poets being a little bit more ready to kind of stand up and stand out, and not to be as caught up in complexity as they are in kind of wishing for change. Natalie Diaz, I think, does both beautifully. Jericho Brown, again, two Pulitzer Prize winners right there. So I think there's a lot out there, from the pages of the New Yorker to just other things. You can sign up at poets.org for a poem a day, which will get a poem to your email, to your inbox every morning, chosen by a poet. And it has like 78,000 subscribers, I believe. And it's a great way to kind of keep in touch with some pretty interesting, varied stuff. So those are some, I think, points of entry for folks who might want to bring more poetry into their lives.
So, well, I want to thank you both. And I'm going to quote Catherine Mormoris, who sent a comment that said, "Feels like a contented moment in time." And that's what this whole 90 minutes
my sister,
felt like for me.
My sister Catherine, don't get it, she might get embarrassed. My editor-in-chief said you need a privileged reader, like who reads your work before it's published. So that's my sister Catherine.
Oh, great.
Well, kudos. She's whatever she's doing, keep it up. Well, thank you both. We look forward to your future work. Audience, thank you very much for joining us today. We don't have dates yet, but we've got 2 things that we're working on. So there'll be some other programs soon. And, again, it's Steve and David, it's been great meeting you both and being here as you both get together. So
that's great. David, I'll see you soon in New York. And Catherine, thank you. Bruce.
Yeah, Bruce, thank you guys for making this happen and testing it out and getting us organized. We'll have to do this at reunions.
There you go.
We will plan something for all of our authors and artists.
That'd be great.
Absolutely. Again,
I'll just say very briefly, you can reach me at david@davidgroff.com if you want to continue any of this. And Steve, maybe you want to give an email.
Yeah, you could reach me at smormoris 238@aol.com. AOL is an indication of my generation, obviously. So, but it seems to work.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. This was great.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Take care.
Bye-bye all.
Bye.